During the wedding, my daughter quietly slipped a note into my pocket that read, "Dad, help me." I barely had time to glance at it before the ceremony swept me along, but those few words haunted me. My daughter, always cheerful in public, had never asked for help before. Something was wrong. I watched her from a distance, noticing subtle gestures, the way she flinched when her in-laws laughed too loudly, the way she avoided certain family members. It was clear to me that she was trapped in a world that pretended to be perfect. That night, I sat alone and made a decision. I would not wait for justice or intervention from anyone else. For 3 months, I quietly observed, collected evidence, and built a network of allies. I discovered manipulations, hidden accounts, and cruel schemes orchestrated by those who claimed to be her protectors. I wasn't going to confront them directly. No, I had to be smarter. I played my part pretending to be indifferent, letting them think they had won, all while planning a reveal they would never forget. Then came the day. I sent letters, emails, and calls exposing their lies and corruption. Their public image began to crumble as truth came out in ways they couldn't hide. Friends who once turned a blind eye now questioned their integrity. Slowly, their carefully constructed world began to collapse. One by one, they begged for mercy, claiming ignorance and pleading for forgiveness. But I was calm. I wasn't cruel. I was just the father who had been ignored, dismissed, and powerless while my daughter suffered. I offered them a choice: recognize their mistakes, admit their manipulations, and apologize to my daughter or face permanent disgrace. They had no choice but to comply. The power shifted, and my daughter finally had the freedom she deserved. I smiled quietly as she hugged me, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Thank you, Dad." I realized revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about restoring balance, protecting the ones you love, and making sure those who thought themselves untouchable understood the cost of their betrayal. 3 months of patience, planning, and quiet determination had been enough. And in the end, justice wasn't violent. It was inevitable. If you want, I can also rewrite it in a more cinematic, viral-style version perfect for a YouTube revenge story, with suspenseful pacing and jaw-dropping moments. This one reads more like a suspenseful narrative, but a cinematic version could hit millions of views. Do you want me to do that? The wedding was a whirlwind of laughter, music, and flashing cameras. Guests milled about in their finest attire, exchanging pleasantries and capturing every staged smile on their phones. The hall gleamed with crystal chandeliers, white flowers, and satin drapes, all carefully arranged to create the perfect picture of celebration. To anyone watching, it was a joyful, unforgettable day, a milestone that would be remembered fondly in photographs and social media posts. Yet beneath the polished veneer of celebration, an invisible tension pulsed, unnoticed by everyone except me. My daughter moved gracefully among the crowd, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling as if she had no worries in the world. But I knew her well enough to see that the cheer was a mask. It was the same smile she had perfected over the years whenever she faced discomfort or unease. There was something in the way she tilted her head slightly, a subtle hesitation in her gestures, a fleeting shadow in her gaze that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. Something was wrong. I had tried to focus on my role as a father, to share in the joy of her big day, but the feeling of unease gnawed at me relentlessly. The music swelled, the crowd cheered, and the photographer called for another round of pose pictures, yet my mind was elsewhere. I needed to see her, to understand, but the ceremony pressed forward like an unstoppable tide. Then, amidst the laughter and the noise, she approached me quietly. She didn't speak. She couldn't risk drawing attention. Her small hand brushed against mine as she slipped a folded piece of paper into my pocket, so subtly that no one around us noticed. It was a simple act, yet it carried a weight far beyond its size. She leaned in just long enough for me to catch the scent of her perfume, the faint tremor in her hands, and the urgency in her eyes. Without a word, she melted back into the crowd, leaving me with the folded note in my pocket and 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Later, in a quiet corner, I unfolded the paper. The words were simple, yet they hit me like a thunderclap. "Dad, help me." Only 3 words, but they carried a lifetime of fear, desperation, and silent suffering. My heart tightened. How long had she been enduring this? How long had she suffered in silence before finally trusting me enough to ask for help in the most discreet way possible? I could feel her anxiety, her careful strategy to avoid being overheard, and the courage it took to reach out in a moment when she was supposed to be celebrating the happiest day of her life. I studied the handwriting, every curve and loop, familiar and yet tinged with a distress I had never seen before. It was a call for rescue, a subtle signal that she could not voice aloud. The crowded hall outside continued its cacophony, but inside me, time slowed. My mind raced to understand what had brought her to this point. Her marriage, which everyone else assumed was perfect, was clearly not as it appeared. She had endured manipulation, suppression, or some form of cruelty so quietly that none of her friends or family could see it. And now, in a fleeting moment of trust, she had chosen me, the one person she believed would hear her without judgment, the one person who could act decisively. I felt a rush of emotions: anger, fear, guilt, and determination, all colliding in an overwhelming tide. Anger at those who had forced her into this position, fear for her safety and well-being, guilt for not noticing the signs earlier, and an unshakable resolve to protect her at any cost. The note was more than a plea, it was a lifeline, a fragile bridge between her silent suffering and my duty as her father. I tucked it carefully back into my pocket, not wanting to draw attention to it, yet feeling its weight against my chest like a constant reminder of the responsibility now resting on my shoulders. For the rest of the ceremony, I couldn't fully participate. Every smile I forced, every congratulatory handshake I exchanged, every toast I raised felt hollow, filtered through the lens of that note. My eyes kept darting to her, watching for signs of distress and analyzing the interactions around her. Every word spoken by her in-laws, every glance exchanged, every subtle gesture felt magnified. I began to notice patterns I had missed before, moments of subtle control, thinly veiled criticisms masked as jokes, the way her words were sometimes interrupted or disregarded. The truth was slowly emerging, piece by piece, and it was far more troubling than I had feared. By the end of the day, as the crowd thinned and the last guests departed, the note remained a silent companion in my pocket. It was small, unassuming, yet it carried the power to change everything. My daughter had entrusted me with her hidden reality, and I knew that nothing could ever make me ignore that trust. That note was the spark that would ignite the path of justice and protection, the first signal in what would become a carefully orchestrated journey to rescue her and hold accountable those who had made her suffer in silence. In that crowded hall, amidst laughter and celebration, a father silently vowed that he would answer the plea of a note so quietly delivered, and that the day would come when his daughter would be free, not just for a moment, but forever. After that fleeting moment at the wedding, I became acutely aware of every subtle movement, every whispered conversation, and every shadow that passed between my daughter and the people around her. The note she had slipped into my pocket was more than a plea. It was a warning, a quiet alarm signaling that the life she presented to the world was far from the reality she endured behind closed doors. I couldn't act impulsively. I had to understand the full scope of what was happening before making a single move. I had to observe, gather, and prepare. The first weeks were the hardest. Every day, I watched from a distance, pretending to go about my own life, all while keeping a keen eye on the dynamics of her household. I noticed the tiny gestures that told a hidden story, the slight flinch when a particular family member entered the room, the tension in her shoulders when conversations turned toward money or inheritance, the way she subtly avoided certain dinners or gatherings. These were not random acts of discomfort. They were the markers of control, manipulation, and fear that no one else seemed to notice. I began keeping a mental log of the interactions. There were the whispered instructions that others gave her, the subtle but pointed remarks meant to undermine her confidence, and the constant, invisible pressure to conform to expectations that were not hers. Even her closest friends seemed to underestimate the intensity of her struggle, often laughing off comments that to her felt like nails in her self-esteem. Watching this, I felt a rising mixture of anger and sorrow, anger at the cruelty masked behind polite smiles, and sorrow for the way my daughter had been forced to endure it in silence. But observation was not enough. I needed proof. I started to notice patterns, accounts that didn't add up, schedules that were overly controlled, and casual remarks that revealed secrets meant to remain hidden. Every email, every message, every social media post became a potential clue. At first, it was tedious, even exhausting, to track these tiny threads, but each piece of evidence told me more about the people who were undermining her freedom. I began to understand not only who was involved, but also how carefully they had orchestrated her daily life to appear normal to outsiders. I also discovered subtle manipulations that were psychological rather than overtly abusive. They were masterful in their cruelty conversations designed to sow doubt, compliments that came with hidden criticisms, acts of generosity that carried strings I had never imagined. I watched as she smiled politely while hiding her exhaustion, nodding in agreement while secretly questioning every word. It became clear that her pleas at the wedding were not an isolated moment of distress. They were the culmination of months, perhaps years of invisible pressure and carefully concealed torment. At night, I replayed scenes in my mind, analyzing conversations for hidden meanings, noticing discrepancies that others overlooked. Her laughter, once so free and easy, now sometimes felt forced. Her gestures, once confident, were now restrained, careful. The more I observed, the more I realized that those around her had built a facade that allowed them to maintain power, while keeping their actions invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. I had to see past the mask, and I had to do it without tipping them off. I started to notice that my daughter had small acts of quiet resistance. A word left unsaid, a hesitation in following an instruction, a fleeting expression of frustration, all small but significant hints that she had not surrendered completely. She was trying to navigate this world carefully, holding herself together, but the burden was obvious. Those moments became my compass, guiding me to where the most insidious control lay. Every gesture, no matter how subtle, spoke volumes about the power dynamics I needed to understand. By the end of the second month, I had pieced together a clearer picture of the manipulation at play. It was both subtle and deliberate, a network of intimidation hidden behind smiles, polite conversation, and family traditions. I had identified the individuals most involved in controlling her life and the mechanisms they used to enforce their will. It was painstaking work, but it was necessary. I realized that a hasty intervention would be ineffective, or worse, could provoke retaliation that would harm my daughter further. Through this period of observation, I also learned more about my daughter than I had ever known. I saw her resilience, her quiet intelligence, and her unspoken courage. Despite the constant pressure, she had managed to maintain her dignity and hope. This realization strengthened my resolve. I was not merely preparing for revenge. I was preparing to protect her fully, to restore her agency, and to reclaim the life that had been subtly stolen from her. Observation became the foundation of my plan. I knew that understanding the full scope of the situation was essential, not just for justice, but to ensure my actions would be precise, impactful, and irreversible. Every detail I recorded, every gesture I noted, every secret I uncovered became a tool. And in the quiet, unnoticed corners of daily life, I silently vowed that the suffering she had endured would not go unanswered. The time of reckoning was approaching, and when it came, it would be based on truth, strategy, and the careful preparation that these months of observation had allowed me to achieve. By the time 3 months had passed since the wedding, I had observed everything. Every subtle gesture, every hidden conversation, every whispered command had been noted and analyzed. But observation alone was not enough. I knew that acting without a plan could backfire, and I refused to let my daughter suffer any further. Strategic planning became my only path forward, a careful orchestration of actions designed to ensure that the truth would emerge and justice would be served. I needed a plan that was precise, discreet, and irreversible. I began by cataloging all the information I had gathered. Conversations were remembered word for word, messages were photographed, and schedules were mapped. I identified the key players, those who held the most influence over my daughter's life, and assessed their weaknesses. Each person had a pattern, a rhythm, and an Achilles heel, and I meticulously noted them. Some relied on appearances and public perception. Others depended on subtle manipulation and fear to maintain control. Understanding their psychology was essential. Next, I considered timing. A poorly timed intervention could alert them to my intentions, causing them to tighten control over my daughter or even punish her. I studied their routines, their habits, and their schedules. Every dinner, every meeting, every public appearance was noted. I waited for moments when they were most vulnerable, when their arrogance would make them careless, and when the truth could be revealed in a way that could not be denied or suppressed. Patience was crucial. I could not rush this. Any misstep would put my daughter at risk. Then came the technology aspect. Emails, social media, and financial transactions all were pieces of the puzzle. I collected screenshots, backed up messages, and even discreetly tracked certain patterns that revealed hidden dealings. The perpetrators were clever, but they were not infallible. They had built walls of deception. But every wall has cracks. My job was to find them and use them. I also ensured that every piece of evidence was backed up securely and could be presented publicly without question. There would be no room for denials. At the same time, I strengthened my network. I quietly reached out to a few trusted allies, people who understood the situation and could assist without drawing attention. Some were old friends. Others were professionals who could verify evidence or provide insight into patterns I might have missed. I maintained absolute discretion, never revealing more than necessary, ensuring that the plan remained mine alone until the moment of execution. Trust was limited, but these few allies were invaluable in ensuring the plan's success. I also considered the human factor, my daughter herself. She had been living under pressure and manipulation for months, and I could not simply pull her out without preparing her psychologically. I started subtle conversations, carefully guiding her to build confidence without revealing the full plan. I wanted her to feel empowered, to regain her sense of agency, so that when the time came, she would not feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was about to happen. Her resilience and intelligence were remarkable, and I knew that empowering her would be a key factor in the plan's success. Every step was calculated. I imagined multiple scenarios, from the most favorable to the worst case, and devised contingencies. I prepared statements, evidence compilations, and even subtle hints that could be released at the right time to create pressure without immediate confrontation. The goal was not to destroy recklessly, but to ensure accountability. Those who had manipulated and controlled my daughter would face consequences, but the plan had to be airtight. There could be no mistakes, no loopholes. Emotionally, it was taxing. I spent long nights awake, running through strategies, imagining reactions, and testing possible outcomes. The weight of responsibility was immense. I had to anticipate every move, every lie, every attempt at deflection. Yet amid the planning, I felt a strange calm. I was no longer reacting, I was creating. I was building a framework that would bring justice to my daughter and ensure her freedom. Every small victory I planned, every revelation I anticipated, was a step closer to restoring balance. Finally, I allowed myself to visualize the endgame. I imagined the moment when the truth would emerge, when the people who had so confidently believed they were untouchable would realize their position was untenable. I imagined my daughter's relief, her gratitude, and the sense of empowerment she would feel. Every detail of the plan was designed to maximize that outcome: clarity, exposure, accountability, and freedom. The 3 months of observation had given me the insight, and now strategic planning gave me the blueprint to act decisively. The plan was complete. It was intricate, precise, and unrelenting. Each move had a purpose, each step a consequence. I had prepared not just for revenge, but for justice, protection, and liberation. The foundation had been observation, the structure was strategy. And when the first domino fell, everything else would follow with unstoppable momentum. The time of quiet patience had ended. The time of careful action was about to begin, and nothing would stand in the way of giving my daughter the life she had been denied. The moment to act had finally arrived. After months of careful observation and meticulous planning, everything was in place. I knew exactly what needed to be done, who needed to be confronted, and how to expose the hidden truths without putting my daughter at further risk. Revenge, I reminded myself, was not about anger. It was about precision, control, and accountability. The people who had manipulated her life, stripped away her agency, and forced her into silence were about to realize that every lie had consequences. I began subtly, letting the pressure build without alerting anyone. A discreet message here, a carefully timed email there, each revealing just enough information to cause doubt and uncertainty among the perpetrators. I watched them react, noticing small fissures in their confidence. They began questioning each other, wondering if someone else had discovered their schemes. They had always believed themselves untouchable, but cracks were appearing, and they didn't know where they were coming from. The first direct action was exposure. I had compiled documents, screenshots, and recordings that proved the manipulations, lies, and hidden agendas. I sent these materials to key people in their circle people whose opinion mattered to them, whose judgment carried weight. Within days, subtle tremors of panic began to ripple through their world. Calls were made, messages exchanged, and suddenly, the web of control they had relied on for so long started unraveling. Their perfect image, the one they had carefully cultivated for years, was starting to fracture. Simultaneously, I ensured that my daughter remained unaware of the full extent of the plan until the right moment. She was still vulnerable, still adapting to the reality of the changes in her life. I wanted her to feel safe, empowered, and confident when the culmination arrived. I guided her quietly, helping her rebuild small freedoms and regain a sense of control over her own life. Her trust in me, demonstrated by that note at the wedding, was a bond I could not betray. She was not a pawn, she was the reason every move mattered. As the evidence spread and the manipulators' defenses weakened, I began orchestrating the confrontations. Publicly, their reputations began to crumble. They tried to spin stories, offer excuses, and deflect blame, but the weight of proof was overwhelming. Friends, colleagues, and family members, people who had previously turned a blind eye, now confronted them with undeniable facts. Every lie they had told, every hidden manipulation, every calculated move to control my daughter was laid bare. They were forced to answer, to acknowledge the reality they had worked so hard to hide. The emotional impact was just as crucial as the practical one. I had spent months understanding their psychology, predicting their responses, and preparing contingencies for every possible reaction. They were not only confronted with evidence, but with the moral weight of their actions. I knew they could not defend themselves ethically, no matter how clever or manipulative they had been. It was a slow burn of accountability, a careful dismantling of power that ensured they could not recover quickly or continue to harm my daughter. During this time, my daughter began to feel the shift in dynamics. She noticed the changes in the people around her, the sudden hesitations, the thinly veiled panic, and the awkward apologies that began to emerge. It was as if the world she had endured was suddenly being turned inside out. The relief in her eyes when she realized that the control was slipping from those who had held it so tightly was indescribable. For the first time in months, maybe years, she experienced freedom, not just a fleeting moment, but a tangible sense of autonomy returning to her life. I orchestrated one final sequence of actions, ensuring that there was no chance for denial or retaliation. Every piece of evidence was presented clearly and indisputably, every claim verified, every timeline corroborated. The people responsible for manipulating my daughter were confronted publicly, in ways that could not be ignored, dismissed, or hidden. Their web of lies collapsed, their carefully constructed facade shattered, and their influence evaporated in the face of truth. Even as they begged, pleaded, and tried to salvage some semblance of dignity, it was too late. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and I held the power to restore balance. I chose not cruelty but justice. I gave them the opportunity to acknowledge their actions, apologize, and accept accountability, but they knew that any attempt to continue their manipulations would fail. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and my daughter was finally free to live her life without fear. Throughout it all, I watched quietly, satisfied but not vengeful in the traditional sense. The revenge was not a display of malice. It was a calculated reclamation of what had been taken from my daughter. The orchestrated exposure, the dismantling of false narratives, and the enforcement of accountability had achieved exactly what I had set out to do. My daughter could now walk with confidence, knowing that those who had tried to control her would never have the same power again. And in the midst of it all, she found me. She hugged me, tears streaming down her face, whispering words I had longed to hear since that day at the weddings. "Thank you, Dad." In that embrace, I understood the true power of strategic execution. Revenge, when planned and carried out with care, does not destroy, it restores. It does not humiliate, it liberates. And it does not end with anger, it ends with justice, balance, and the quiet triumph of protecting those you love. The reckoning came quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, but it gained momentum with every passing day. Those who had orchestrated my daughter's suffering could no longer hide behind smiles, polite words, or feigned innocence. The carefully constructed walls of control and manipulation that had shielded them from scrutiny for so long began to crumble. and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Each action they had taken, every hidden conversation, every subtle attempt to dominate or demean, was now being exposed, and they were forced to confront the consequences of their choices. At first, they tried denial. Their responses were measured, practiced, the kind of rehearsed words you use when you believe the truth cannot be proven. But they underestimated the depth of the evidence and the precision with which it had been compiled. Emails, messages, and testimonies formed a chain of undeniable facts. Attempts to refute or manipulate the situation only deepened their entanglement, creating a web from which there was no escape. Their confident expressions faltered, replaced by nervous glances and awkward silences. The psychological weight of the reckoning began to take hold. People who had once feared or respected them now questioned every action and word. Colleagues, friends, and even casual acquaintances began to confront them, seeking clarity and demanding accountability. Every excuse they offered was scrutinized, dissected, and ultimately dismissed. The authority they had wielded for so long vanished under the steady pressure of truth, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Their world, carefully crafted to appear flawless, now showed the cracks and fractures that had always existed beneath the surface. The reckoning was not just public, it was personal. Those who had tried to suppress my daughter's voice now faced the moral weight of their actions. They had forced her to endure months, perhaps years, of manipulation and quiet suffering. The subtle psychological tactics, once invisible to outsiders, now became painfully clear. Each carefully veiled insult, each controlling gesture, each attempt to undermine her independence was laid bare. They had to see in stark clarity the human cost of their choices, and there was no room for denial. As the days progressed, their desperation grew. They began to beg, pleading for mercy or understanding, as if apologies could erase the months of control and fear they had inflicted. But the reckoning was not about punishment for punishment's sake. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that my daughter's voice, her freedom, and her dignity were recognized. The pleas they offered were met with measured calm, a clear expectation that acknowledgement, accountability, and sincere change were the only acceptable outcomes. There was no room for manipulation or further deceit. Every move was monitored, every word weighed. My daughter, observing this, began to regain her sense of empowerment. She had lived in fear, restrained by the unseen strings of those around her, but now she could see the truth laid bare. She watched as those who had belittled, controlled, and deceived her were confronted with undeniable evidence of their actions. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she witnessed a shift in power, a shift that gave her the confidence to assert herself without fear. Her eyes, once wary and cautious, now held clarity and relief. The reckoning was also transformative for the manipulators. They had learned that control built on deceit is fragile, that power obtained through fear is temporary, and that accountability cannot be evaded forever. They were forced to confront not only the evidence, but also the social, emotional, and moral consequences of their actions. Friends and family who had once been passive or complicit now demanded explanations, apologies, and reparations. There was no place to hide, no excuses that could excuse the harm inflicted. Every attempt at rationalization was met with calm, factual responses that left no room for evasion. Throughout this process, I remained present but restrained. My role was not to humiliate, but to ensure that justice was served, that the focus remained on accountability, and that my daughter's well-being was prioritized. I watched as they grappled with their newfound vulnerability, witnessing the realization that every subtle act of manipulation had finally caught up with them. The reckoning was complete when they had no remaining defenses, no allies to shield them, and no way to reverse the consequences. In the end, the most significant aspect of the reckoning was its clarity. Truth had a precision that deception could never match. The manipulators could no longer pretend that everything was fine, could no longer hide behind polite facades or false smiles. They were exposed, accountable, and compelled to acknowledge their actions. And my daughter, standing at the center of this storm, finally experienced the relief, freedom, and empowerment that had been denied to her for so long. The emotional release was profound. She embraced the realization that she was no longer trapped, that the people who had controlled her could no longer hold sway. I felt her gratitude in her every gesture, every tear, every quiet word of thanks. The reckoning had not been about vengeance alone. It had been about justice, liberation, and the restoration of dignity. And as she looked at me, her father, I knew that every careful observation, every strategic plan, and every calculated action had led to this moment. The undeniable triumph of truth over manipulation, and the restoration of balance in a world that had once seemed completely controlled by deceit. With the reckoning complete and the manipulators confronted, the world finally began to feel different. There was a sense of quiet calm, as if the air itself had shifted, carrying with it the weight of years of suppressed tension. My daughter, once trapped in a web of control and deceit, could finally breathe. The restoration of her freedom was not instant, but it was undeniable. Every subtle chain that had bound her was broken, and she could begin to reclaim the life that had been denied to her for so long. The first days after the confrontation were delicate. My daughter needed space to process the upheaval, to understand that the threats, manipulation, and hidden pressures she had endured were no longer controlling her life. She walked through her home differently, with a subtle confidence replacing the cautious steps she had once taken. Conversations that had previously required careful navigation now flowed freely. She smiled more naturally, laughed more openly, and no longer flinched at casual remarks. The restoration of her autonomy was evident in every small gesture, in every newfound freedom she exercised. I remained by her side, guiding without interfering, allowing her to regain control at her own pace. My role had shifted from protector and strategist to a steady presence, a reassurance that she was no longer alone. She began to make decisions independently, some small and simple, like what to wear or what to eat, and others far more significant, like asserting boundaries with the people who had once sought to control her. Each act of choice, each moment of self-determination, was a victory in itself, a confirmation that the years of manipulation had lost their power. The manipulators, once so confident and untouchable, now faced the lasting consequences of their actions. Public exposure, social accountability, and moral reckoning ensured that they could never regain the same influence over my daughter, or anyone else, for that matter. They had been forced to acknowledge their wrongdoings, apologize where possible, and take responsibility in ways that were visible and undeniable. The power that had been unjustly held was redistributed, restoring balance to relationships and dynamics that had long been skewed. The justice served was deliberate, measured, and irreversible. But the true restoration was not only external, it was deeply personal. My daughter began to rebuild her sense of self, her confidence, and her trust in her own judgment. She could pursue her ambitions, express her opinions freely, and navigate relationships without the looming shadow of manipulation. Her laughter, once cautious and restrained, became spontaneous. Her eyes, which had sometimes reflected fear or doubt, now shone with clarity and determination. Watching her regain her sense of self was perhaps the most profound form of justice I could witness. As she began to thrive, our bond deepened in ways that words cannot fully capture. That note she had slipped into my pocket at the wedding, a simple plea of, "Dad, help me," had set into motion months of careful planning, observation, and action. Now, the outcome reflected the depth of that trust. She could look at me without fear, without hesitation, knowing that I had listened, understood, and acted decisively on her behalf. The restoration of her life was intertwined with the restoration of our relationship, strengthened by the trials we had endured together. The manipulator's defeat also sent a clear message, not only to them, but to anyone who might attempt similar control in the future. Justice had been served not with vengeance alone, but with strategy, patience, and clarity. It demonstrated that no deception could remain hidden forever, and that accountability would eventually prevail. For my daughter, this was liberating. For me, it was a profound affirmation of the principles I had followed: protect, restore, and empower, rather than merely punish. In the weeks that followed, she began to pursue her passions and goals without hesitation. Opportunities that had once seemed intimidating or inaccessible now felt attainable. She embraced friendships, professional pursuits, and personal growth with a confidence that had been suppressed for far too long. Her life was no longer dictated by fear, manipulation, or hidden agendas. It was hers to shape, freely and fully. The restoration of justice had cleared the path for her to live authentically, unburdened by the weight of others' deceit. And through it all, I realized that revenge, when executed thoughtfully, had a dual purpose. It was a tool for accountability, and it was a means to restore the dignity, freedom, and life of someone you love. The manipulators had faced the consequences of their actions. But more importantly, my daughter had reclaimed her world. She had regained her voice, her confidence, and her agency, and in that restoration, justice had been achieved. Finally, one evening, as we sat quietly together, she reached out and held my hand. There were no words needed, for the depth of gratitude, relief, and love was palpable between us. That moment, quiet and profound, symbolized everything the months of struggle and planning had aimed to achieve. Her life had been restored, the balance of justice had been reaffirmed, and the future, unlike the past, was truly hers to shape. In that embrace, I understood fully that justice, when executed with precision, patience, and care, could heal as much as it could punish.